you and I had a conversation in the hallway about what it means to be a sponsor for a family who is coming here. Can you give us a brief rundown of what is required and whether or not we need sponsors in the community right now?
Yeah, thank you. So sponsorship, the sponsorship programs that we've been kind of involved with are part of the United for Ukraine program that the U.S. government launched and initiated back in, I'm not sure which month, it was after the war started, at some point, maybe March, April-ish of something like that, of 2022. But under this program, they allow for individuals within the United States, U.S. citizens, who are financially able to sort of step forward and partner or pair up one-on-one with a family or a person in Ukraine that needs support. So as a sponsor, the process for me is filling out what's called an I-134A form, and this is a sort of an affidavit of support I have to fill out for each individual in a family, basically proving to the U.S. government that A, I'm a good person, right? They do some background checks, and then I have to provide a number of different documents proving my ability and my financial means that would be necessary to support a family for a period of 2 years. So I essentially promise that I won't let them become a ward of the state. They're not going to end up on, services provided by the state. I take care of them. So that's the process. It's just some paperwork and a bunch of documentation. And once I'm approved as a sponsor and they're approved as a citizen of Ukraine, and they upload certain documents like passports and immunization records, things like that. Once both sides are approved, then the Department of Homeland Security issues a travel authorization for them to come here. And I think they have about 90 days to get here at that point, and during which time we plan for their arrival with housing and so forth.
How does temporary protected status impact the people who Iowa NICE serves?
Yes, that's a great question, and I'm hoping that Jessica can answer the really tough questions on this topic. But the reason I'm very interested in this topic is because, as I said, most all of the families, in fact, all but one, have come here under the Uniting for Ukraine program. So they're here technically as non-immigrant parolees. They're not even technically refugees in terms of status, but they're here as parolees. And they're classified as a UHP, or Ukrainian Humanitarian Parolee. These individuals are allowed to stay in the United States for 24 months, and the government makes the assumption that they will be returning to Ukraine after a period of 24 months. So with that being said, the first families that we sponsored arrived here in the United States in mid-October of last year, which means that next October, October of 2024, they will be asked to either return to Ukraine or become illegal, or they could leave to Canada or Mexico, but they will not legally be able to stay here in the United States after 24 months. So back in, I want to say it was August-ish, the U.S. government basically came out and they said that they would allow people who came here either before the humanitarian parolee status is available or people already here as humanitarian parolees. They were all given the option to apply for temporary protected status. That status would then be allow them to stay here in the United States through, I believe it's August of 2025, I believe is the date on that, right? But that would then essentially have them in the United States with a dual status, humanitarian parolee plus TPS. So anyway, it creates some complications. You can imagine that all the families that are here are thinking about this, right? They've got jobs, their kids are in school, they've got homes, they've bought cars, they're becoming members of our community, and they're scared. They're like, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna have to leave in a year. Can I get this TPS thing? Will this solve my problems? And unfortunately, the answer is not really. It does give them a temporary stay, a little bit longer than some of the other statuses right now, but it's certainly not a guarantee, and it's not substantially different from the status that they're already here under, which is UHP. I hope that answered your question, but our families are very concerned about TPS status, and we have put together an immigration task force for our group so that we can begin to navigate the right answers for our families. And I do believe it's very likely that most of our families will be applying for TPS status as kind of a backup status in the event the government doesn't extend the UHP status.
I just wanted to ask, is there anything that the community that we're in right now can do to help the people who are coming to us from Ukraine?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I would always be delighted to have people join us in our efforts to help the Ukrainian families, whether that be through financial donations, whether it be through just volunteering your time to help a family get to school or get to a biometric screening appointment in Des Moines, or any number of volunteer opportunities are out there. But in addition to that, and more specifically related to this immigration concern we have for our families, I would say to maybe make some calls. I have some handouts up here. There are a few bills that have been brought forth. Of course, a bill is not a law. A bill is not even very likely to become law, but there's some really good things that are out there that the government is considering that will very much help our friends from Ukraine. Some of them include, and I'm not going to go through the full list here, but things like a parole pathway for U parolees, which means basically once that time is close to expiring, that 24 months, we would like them to have the opportunity to reapply. That has not been provided for yet, right? So that's a pretty easy one. Hopefully the government will do that. We also would like to see the federal government extend essential benefits for our Ukrainian parolees. At this time, benefits are starting to be cut back, in part due to political pressures, I believe, and budget concerns. But some of those essential benefits are starting to be pulled back. We would like the ability for our humanitarian parolees to get an advanced parole travel authorization, and what that means is that once they come here under under UHP status, they are not allowed to leave the country and come back, which doesn't seem like a big deal until you understand that, as an example, one of our young ladies lost their fiance in the war and had to go back for the funeral, and that was an absolute monumental task. So other families have left their parents who are now very ill, and there's a number of reasons why they might want to leave the country and come back. So we'd like that to be corrected. The Lautenberg pathway, I'm sure that Jessica can speak more intelligently on this topic, but we would like to see that reinstated and applied to those Ukrainians who would qualify for permanent legal status through that pathway. And lastly, we would like a better mechanism, an easier mechanism to get these families visas, employment visas. Unfortunately, right now, as a humanitarian parolee who is maybe very well educated and employed here in the United States, we don't have the ability to get them work visas. They just simply don't qualify, most of them. There's a number of qualifications for visas, and our families just simply are not there. So we would like to see a visa status or a visa application process in place for families that are here and really just probably will not want to return. They understand that going back to Ukraine, even when the war stops, is going to be 10 years before their communities are rebuilt, their children have been through enough, and most of the families we have sponsored hope very much they'll be allowed to stay. So we would like the employer sponsor process to be enabling Ukrainians.
So it started in 1990 with a bipartisan bill and under the George H.W. Bush administration. So what it is essentially the authorization where the Department of Homeland Security, so the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, gets to designate certain countries who have either undergone civil unrest or humanitarian crisis or an environmental disaster. And they are allowed to designate those countries because, well, let me give you some examples. So in 1998, I think, Hurricane Mitch devastated Nicaragua and Honduras, and people fled for their lives, and towns were destroyed, they had nowhere to go. Many people came to the United States. So those people were allowed to be designated if you arrived in the United States on or before, I think it's 1999, there's a certain date in 1999. Every country is different, that's something to keep in mind, and I'll talk more about that later. But If they were here on or before 1990, that date in 1999, they were allowed to apply for temporary protected status. Now, another example is El Salvador was designated for temporary protected status in 2001 due to a devastating earthquake. And so things like that, right? More recently, places like Ukraine, of course, obviously a humanitarian crisis, Afghanistan, obviously, for obvious reasons, right? With the Taliban overthrowing the Afghan government. Other places more recent, Venezuela. Those are the most recent three, but just to sort of compare, it can range in reasons, and the Department of Homeland Security basically has the ultimate say over who they're going to designate. You know, the executive branch can decide. So what TPS is, though, it is temporary. It's supposed to be temporary, but I will tell you, all of those places like El Salvador and Honduras and Nicaragua, who were designated in 1998, they've been allowed to renew their temporary protected status because the Department of Homeland Security, every 3 or 4 years or so, does what's called a re-registration. So if you can show that you've had TPS before during the first designation cycle, and it's called, the terminology is a little strange, but when they designate the country, that's like the initial registration. So when a country is designated, you have a certain time period that you're allowed to register that you're from that country. And the application requirements are pretty minimal. It's a lot of check boxes like, are you from the country you say you're from? And were you here on the date that you say you were here on? And does it qualify under this deadline or the date that is put forth by the Department of Homeland Security, or at that time, you know, the INS? So once you've done that and it gets re-registered or redesignated, you know, every couple of years, then you're allowed to reapply. So if you think about it this way, people from El Salvador who have had TPS since 2001, and I have a number of clients like this, have been here for 20 plus years. So in that nature, temporary protected status isn't very temporary. But at the same time, you know, I completely see why, just like what Angela was talking about, you know, it's not like countries are just, or, you know, places like Ukraine are just going to be able to, you know, rebuild after a year or two. Like, what are those people supposed to do? They've established lives elsewhere. You know, they have families now. Most of my clients who are from Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, who got TPS designation in the first go around, you know, they have grown children who are, you know, like over 20 plus years old. So temporary protected status, though by its nature is temporary, really it hasn't been. My clients who have been here for 20 plus years have a work permit, they have social security numbers, they've been paying taxes the whole time, you know what I mean? So they're established members of the community. Now, the difference between temporary protected status and, like, you know, more permanent status, so like a green card, right? So lawful permanent residence or a US citizen. The difference is that TPS is not a path, there's no path to any sort of permanent status like that. You have to go through some other method or some other process to get that, whether it be a family-based petition or a humanitarian-based petition, some other form or other option. TPS is, by its very nature, something that came about through Congress that was never enacted in a statute. So that's really one of the main differences and why the executive branch has been able to just sort of redesignate or renew people with TPS, you know, every few years. So
what is the difference between TPS and asylum?
Okay, great question. So like I was saying, TPS, temporary in its nature, in that if you have TPS for a certain number of years, you're not going to get a green card. That's just not how that works. If you're applying for asylum, it seems similar, and it's understandable that people might conflate the two because they're both a humanitarian process, but they're actually markedly different. So if I'm applying for asylum, I am telling the US government that I have been either a victim of persecution in my home country Well, I have a well-founded fear of future persecution if I were to return to my home country based on one of 4 or 5 enumerated classes. So based on race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or that you're a member of a particular social group. So a particular social group would be something like, it could be women in Sudan. It's just what identifying characteristics that are distinguishable, that identify you, and that you're a victim of persecution or you have a well-founded fear of persecution based on that like identifying characteristic. So if I were to apply, let's compare and contrast a little bit then I guess. So for temporary protected status, the process markedly different than applying for asylum. Applying for TPS is essentially all on paper. You have to go and do like a biometrics appointment, but there's a USCIS officer like in a service center somewhere, checking boxes, making sure you hit all the high points. You said who you are. You said you are who you say you are. You're entered on this day. You have the identifying documentation, passport maybe, and that's about it. And obviously no like disqualifying crime or something like that would make you ineligible for TPS. Whereas asylum is something that is much more labor intensive, and you have what's called the burden of showing that you're eligible for that. So that can mean a number of different things depending on what court you are in, because you have to either get asylum either via an interview in front of a USCIS officer, that's usually when you apply affirmatively, or what I call defensively if you're in immigration court. And the government's trying to remove you, but you're saying, okay, you might want to try to remove me, but I claim asylum because X, Y, and Z reason, right? So let's say you're in immigration court, you have to present your case to an immigration judge. There'll be a hearing with testimony, and the ICE attorneys will be able to ask questions, and the judge can ask questions, and your attorney, if you have one, asks questions. And similarly, if you are appearing in front of a USCIS officer, you have to, it's much more relaxed. It's not, a testimony sort of situation, but you are under oath, telling your story.